Hey, welcome back to my channel. My name is Megan, and I'm a professional writer and editor and a published author. I promise that I won't be recording in an empty bedroom forever. I just don't know where else to go right now. And yes, I'm aware of how funny this looks, but the turtleneck screws it up. Anyway, I recently published this video about my experience writing my first fantasy novel, and I didn't think it was going to do very well. I was wrong. You guys loved this video, which is great because I loved recording it. Yay. I mentioned in that video that I created what I'm calling a glossary for all of my world building, which I learned you have to have before you start writing a fantasy or sci-fi novel. You can't skip that step. Now, I think all books to some degree need world building, but I think this is even more vital for fantasy novels because we're often dealing with magic, lengthy histories, complex relationships, and sometimes entire universes that are completely fictitious. Everyone has their own process. I'm just going to share my personal approach and how I went about creating this glossary. As it stands, I have it divided up into a few key sections. The first section details the various magical races that we'll meet. I have 9, and I don't think I'm going to add any more. I wrote little biographies for each of them to expand on their histories, their reputations, where they live, who their rulers are, what their religions are, if they have one, their politics, the population size, and on and on. Another big part of this is their powers. What magic are they capable of? What are the boundaries of that magic? Someone in the comments on my previous video left awesome feedback about this. They said, I also write fantasy, but I'm a history teacher by trade. When I teach my students about different civilizations, I use the GRAPES acronym to highlight the important aspects: geography, religion, achievements, politics, economics, and society. I started using this with world building, and it made such a difference in making my settings really come alive and have a lot of depth. I loved this idea, and it's already helped me really fill out the details of some of my races because religion, for example, was something I hadn't considered. So thank you to the person who left this very helpful comment. The next section in my glossary is the various settings. I currently have 6, but I think I'll probably add more to make this continent a little more rounded out. I shared in my last video that I even sketched a map, a very rough map, but a map nonetheless. It doesn't only show the boundary lines between territories. I've also marked mountain ranges, forests, roads, and bodies of water. In addition, I wrote down who lives in each of those territories. Next up is a list of my main and supporting characters. I have 17 that I wrote biographies for. To be honest, I struggled a little bit with some of the supporting characters because I didn't know if they were important enough to expand on to this degree. But the ones that I selected, I think they're important because even if they're not present throughout the entire novel, they are all in some way important to the plot. This section was very eye-opening for me because this was where I really realized how much I was still missing. In particular, I hadn't clearly enough defined different characters' motivation. Every character wants something, even if it's small, even if we don't see it a lot in the story. They're still motivated by something. There has to be a reason that every character does everything they do. I also have to be able to explain, even just to myself, why they didn't already achieve whatever it is they're motivated by. I spent a lot more time getting to know my characters very closely, and what I learned is that in some cases, they wouldn't do what I imagined them doing. For example, my female protagonist, I'd planned to have her pretend to be human, even though she wasn't, and she was actually hiding her powers. But as I was writing her biography, her story, I realized she would never hide her powers. That's ridiculous. She would be proud of them. So I scrapped the whole idea. Instead of getting her personality to fit the plot that I had outlined earlier on, I established the character traits and then looked at how they would behave and react. Now, that's not to say that taking the other approach, doing the opposite, wouldn't work. It just wasn't working for me. I needed to understand what type of person she is and then use that to build out the story. Okay, so we talked about the races, the settings, and the characters. Armed with all of that information, I wrote another section on the history of this continent where my story takes place that brings us up to the time when the novel opens. In other words, how did we get here? For example, I have my bad guy. We don't meet him until toward the end of the novel when he finally attacks the more benevolent races. I used this section of my glossary to flesh out why he's evil, because he wasn't always that way. What happened to make him so angry and so vindictive? What nonsense was he up to before we met him? Now, some of these details might not even make it into my novel, but I realized that I can't write what's going to happen to these races and how they react to things without knowing what they've already been through. I had planned to stop there and then go back to an outline of the novel, and I always do my outlines in bullet points. I always try to be very structured, which is usually what I need. I like it to be super organized and concise to start. However, when I was writing about the history, it was in paragraph form, and I just let myself write, like I was writing a story. Surprisingly, this worked very well for me. This is a new genre for me, so I'm staying open-minded to approaches that I haven't tried before, and I started writing what I guess we could call a synopsis in paragraph form, not bullet points. I imagined it in my head like a movie and also like a game, maybe a video game. If this creature does this, how does this one respond? Well, if this one does this, what would happen? This was challenging. There were certain plot points I already knew I wanted to include, but one of the reasons I knew fantasy would be challenging for me is that my stories in the past have tended to be very linear. That's the word my husband came up with, and it describes it perfectly. My books have never been super complicated or a lot to chew on. Now, personally, I don't think this is a bad thing. I've read books with very simple plots and loved them. Sometimes you don't want to read something that's really going to melt your brain, but that's not the case here. For the first time, I want to write something that's really messed up, okay? What I've done in writing this synopsis is I've tried to weave in other stories and subplots to make things deeper and richer. In my book, the bad guy comes back because he wants this thing, but 500 years ago, he didn't even know this thing existed. Instead, he was chasing that thing. This thing is going to make a reappearance to make acquiring the other thing more complicated. If I look at fantasy movies and books that I've watched and read in the past, they're always like that. They're very complex and very twisty. Like, I just finished the ACOTAR series and loved it. If you don't like it, that's okay. I loved it. Oh, the smut, the men, my God. Good stuff. Anyway, those books were never as simple as, we need to find the cauldron, which if you've read the books, you know what I mean. Rather, it was, okay, we need to find the cauldron, which is going to be really hard because it's located in this place, which is full of these creatures who are awful because they did X, Y, and Z. And the location is also heavily protected by magic because hundreds of years ago, ABC happened, and so did this and this and that, and on and on and on. It wasn't so complex that you couldn't follow, but it also wasn't, we need to get the cauldron, let's go. Fantasy is like any genre. There has to be the thing that the protagonist wants and reasons why it's so hard for them to obtain it. Conflict, stakes, tension. Now, the word count isn't what dictated how much time I spent on this glossary, but for context, it ended up being about 15,000 words. I might keep adding to it. It's like my little encyclopedia, like a reference guide, and I will flip back to this while I'm writing this entire novel. There is some overlap. For instance, I talk about each race and their powers. Then I'll have a character where I again talk about their powers, which I already did when I talked about their race. So there is a little bit of that, but I like that because the repetition just helps me become more familiar with all of these details. I need repetition. Here's a recap one more time of what I did, the different sections, in case you want to try it. What's next? Well, I'm going to go back to Save the Cat. I mentioned in my last video that I'm following this to a T. I already referenced it loosely when I was writing my synopsis, and I've read parts of this book so many times that it's ingrained. But I want to be really sure I'm hitting the 15 plot points that this book talks about. I think this approach to writing a novel is so amazing and helpful. So next, I'm going to go back through the glossary and in particular the synopsis, and now I'm going to do an outline in bullet points of the novel, calling out the different points that the blueprint from Save the Cat calls out, so I can make sure I've covered all of them in detail. I know I'm just getting started, but I already feel like I've learned so much and grown so much, which is great. I always want to be growing as a writer and just as a human in general. I've been having a lot of fun, especially since kind of like slowing down and taking a little bit of that pressure off myself, and I'm really excited for the next steps. As of this recording, I think I've finished kind of words, what are they? Sort of visualizing what the first act looks like. I'm really happy with it, but tonight I'm going to share it with, this is going to be the ultimate test, so I'm going to share it with my husband, because if there are plot holes or anything missing, he will find them. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you think you might try writing a glossary of your own, let me know. And yeah, if you're still enjoying hearing about this journey for me, let me know and I'll keep making videos on it. And as always, if you have anything you want to share or contribute, just drop me a comment, or even if you just want to say hello, and I will see you in the next video.